Welcome to World War II Begins, Part 1, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. In order to fully understand World War II, we need to go back and review the ending of the First World War, a generation earlier. The conflict, then known simply as the Great War, lasted from 1914 to 1918. World War I pitted a group of nations known as the Allies against another group of nations known as the Central Powers. The Allies, seen on this map in green, included France, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, and for most of the war, Russia. The United States joined the Allied cause as well, but not until 1917. The Central Powers, seen here in orange, included Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. On November 11, 1918, the world's bloodiest war up until that point ended when Germany signed an armistice, a peace agreement with the Allies. As many as 17 million soldiers and civilians died in more than 4 years of fighting. At the time, World War I had been called the war to end all wars. America's President Woodrow Wilson had called it a war to make the world safe for democracy. Of course, neither of these claims proved to be true. In 1919, leaders from the winning Allied nations met in Paris to decide the terms of peace and to create the post-war world. First, the Allies assigned Germany the sole blame for the war, and then proceeded to disarm and weaken it so much that they thought Germany would never be able to threaten the world again. Second, the map of Europe was redrawn, creating new nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia, partly out of territory that had once belonged to Germany. Third, an international organization called the League of Nations was formed, in large part to prevent future world wars. The Treaty of Versailles, so called because it was signed in the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris, was a bitter pill to swallow for Germany and other nations on the losing side. Germany had surrendered, but it had not been defeated militarily in World War I, and most Germans found the peace terms vindictive and humiliating. The resentment would only grow in the years to come. And even some of the victorious allies, including Italy and Japan, found the Versailles Treaty insulting and unfair. Both nations believed that they deserved more territory than they ultimately received for being on the winning side of World War I. The Great War had been so bloody and destructive that even its winners, in a sense, were losers. Great Britain and France had both seen a generation of their young men dead or maimed. The result, leading into the 1920s and 30s, was a desire by those nations to avoid another war at almost any cost. The United States, for its part, refused to join the new League of Nations and deliberately stepped back from its new role as a world leader. Americans largely came to regret their nation's role in World War I and became increasingly isolationist. They didn't want to get involved in the problems of other nations. In the 1920s, a disturbing new political trend arose in Europe: fascism. The term originated in a political party, the Fascist Party, that seized power in Italy in 1922. The party's leader was Benito Mussolini, a veteran of World War I. He was appointed Prime Minister of Italy after his fascist party took over the government. His people called him Il Duce, the leader. Mussolini believed that a strong man, a dictator, was needed to restore national greatness to Italy, which was still reeling from the war. Fascists believed in a military citizenship that blurred the lines between soldiers and civilians. The government should control every aspect of the lives of citizens to bring about order and stability, Mussolini believed, and citizens should live their lives not necessarily for their own happiness, but to further the aims of the government. Mussolini ruled Italy for more than 20 years as the totalitarian dictator of a one-party police state. Opponents of his rule were arrested or killed. In Germany, Adolf Hitler, also a military veteran, was inspired by Mussolini's success. He founded the National Socialist or Nazi Party in the early 1920s. Hitler's greatest desire was to rearm Germany and make it great again. He wanted revenge for the humiliation he felt his nation had suffered due to the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler was also motivated by his belief in racial purity and Aryan, white superiority. In his book Mein Kampf, Hitler spoke openly of the Jewish peril and his dream to create a master race by eliminating Jews and others that he considered inferior. He spread lies, believed by many at the time that German Jews had somehow stabbed Germany in the back in 1918 and caused it to lose the war. Early in his career, Hitler and the Nazis were treated as something of a joke in Germany. But over time, his power and appeal grew as his countrymen grew more and more desperate. Germans faced a crisis in the 1920s. Because Germany had been made responsible for paying the entire war debt for World War I, the nation's economy was a wreck. Skyrocketing inflation meant that people's money lost its value. And when the Great Depression brought economic disaster to the entire world in the early 1930s, Hitler was in a prime position to take advantage of ordinary Germans' fear, anger, and resentment. In 1933, what once seemed unthinkable happened. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Once in power, Hitler soon assumed the title of Führer and assumed the powers of a dictator. Germany was now under Nazi rule. The entire world watched the political developments in Italy and Germany with fear and concern. From the ashes of World War I had sprung not world peace, but dangerous dictators who threatened renewed war. But it wasn't only Europe that was a threat to peace. In the early 20th century, the tiny island nation of Japan was a world power on the rise. To grow, Japan wanted and needed greater territory and resources. It gained both by invading and occupying its neighbors in the Pacific. On the surface, Japan claimed it was acting to restore Asia for Asians and remove Western colonial rule from the region. In reality, by controlling its neighbors, Japan was acting to create its own empire from which it would dominate the Asian continent and the Pacific Ocean. Japan was technically ruled by an emperor, Hirohito, but he was largely a figurehead, a ruler in name only. The real power behind the Japanese government in the 1930s was the nation's military. By the 1930s, Japan already controlled Korea and Taiwan, and its main rival in mainland Asia was China. In 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria, a province in northeastern China. In a telling sign, the invasion of Manchuria was ordered not by Japan's emperor, but by its generals. Japan and China were both members of the League of Nations, whose laws forbid aggressive actions like Japan's. But when China asked the League for help, it was powerless to intervene. The organization could only condemn Japanese aggression, and in response, Japan simply quit the League of Nations. Adolf Hitler was impressed. When he became chancellor, he followed the Japanese example by withdrawing Germany from the League of Nations as well. In 1937, Japan invaded China, leading to full-scale war in Asia. The Japanese captured the Chinese capital of Nanking and then brutally killed as many as 200,000 civilians. Many Americans were disturbed by the rise of Nazis and fascists in Europe and, to a lesser extent, by Japanese aggression in Asia. But the United States remained firmly isolationist throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, and actually became more so as the situation overseas worsened. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. FDR was not a natural isolationist, but at that time, his nation was consumed by the Great Depression. More than ever, the American people felt it was time to focus on domestic problems at home and not on foreign affairs. In many ways, isolationism was the natural status quo for American foreign policy. As he prepared to leave office in 1796, none other than George Washington had warned his new countrymen that we should not entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition. The U.S. had actually broken with more than a century of tradition by entering World War I on the side of the Allies. And after the war, Americans had turned inward again, electing a Republican president, Warren Harding, who promised a return to normalcy. There was a widespread American belief in the 1920s and 30s that the involvement of the U.S. in the First World War had been a mistake. The war hadn't solved the world's problems or made it safe for democracy. In 1934, the U.S. Senate actually created a committee headed by Senator Gerald Nye to investigate long-standing claims that weapons manufacturers had pushed the U.S. to enter World War I for their own profit. While the Nye Committee didn't find any evidence of such a conspiracy, it did conclude that America had joined the war in large part to protect its own financial interests. The findings made the American people even more cynical and reluctant to become involved in overseas conflicts, in Asia, in Europe, or anywhere else. In 1935 and 1936, Congress passed the first Neutrality Acts intended to keep the U.S. out of a future war. These laws barred Americans from selling weapons or war materials to any other nations at war. They made no distinctions between nations. Great Britain and Nazi Germany, for example, were treated exactly the same. The Neutrality Act of 1937 took things even further. It forbid American ships to carry passengers or goods to nations at war, and it forbid U.S. citizens to travel on the ships of nations at war. These acts were designed to prevent the mistakes of World War I that had drawn America into war against Germany. President Roosevelt was critical of these acts. He felt they would limit his administration's ability to support friendly nations if a war did come. But he could not ignore the clear will of the American people and his voters, and he signed them into law. But FDR did convince Congress to add a provision to the 1937 Act known as cash and carry. Under this policy, the U.S. could sell non-military goods to other nations, but only if they paid for the goods in cash and transported them entirely on their own ships. The provision was set to expire in 2 years. Roosevelt hoped that if Britain and France did go to war with Germany, that cash and carry might allow America to support them in some small way. When Japan invaded China in 1937, FDR took advantage of cash and carry to support the Chinese. China paid for American supplies, and British ships in the Pacific transported the goods. Isolationists in the U.S. strongly criticized the president. They thought he was placing the United States on a path to world war again. By 1936, Adolf Hitler was ready to make a bold move. Since taking power as the Nazi Führer, he started to rearm Germany, secretly building tanks, planes, and weapons in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, in March 1936, Hitler ordered Nazi troops into the Rhineland, a western region of Germany right on the border with neighboring France. According to the Versailles Treaty, the large region was supposed to be a permanent demilitarized zone. This meant that Germany was not supposed to have any soldiers or weapons in the region, leaving a buffer zone between it and France. Now, Hitler boldly defied the treaty by remilitarizing the Rhineland. How did Germany's neighbors respond? Violating the peace terms that Germany had agreed to at the end of the last war could have, and probably should have, meant Great Britain and France declaring war on Germany. But the British and French were desperate to avoid another bloody world war. Their nations had been harmed by the last war almost as much as the losers like Germany. France and Britain weren't exactly isolationist like the U.S. was at the time, but they believed in 1936 that it was better to appease Hitler, to give him what he wanted if it meant avoiding war. Having rearmed the Rhineland with no consequences, Hitler was emboldened. He had gambled that the former allies of the last war would not move to stop him, and he was right. Just 1 month later, an Italian army completed its invasion of Ethiopia in East Africa, enlarging Italy's empire under Mussolini. Hitler had supported the invasion, but most other nations were outraged. Once again, the League of Nations was powerless to solve the crisis or defend Ethiopia, just as it had been unable to respond to Japan's invasion of Manchuria several years earlier. Also in 1936, a brutal 3-year civil war began in Spain when General Francisco Franco, a fascist dictator in the mold of Benito Mussolini, attempted to overthrow Spain's democratically elected government. Germany and Italy aided Franco by giving his side soldiers and weapons. Because the Nazis were able to try out many new weapons and military strategies during the Spanish Civil War, some have called it a dress rehearsal for World War II. Without support from the international community, Spain's government fell to the fascists, giving Hitler and Mussolini a new ally in General Franco. In 1937, Japan invaded China. The developments around the world gravely concerned President Roosevelt. He spoke directly to isolationist Americans in October of that year in what has become known as the Quarantine Speech. FDR spoke of war as a contagion and warned Americans that the epidemic of world lawlessness was spreading in a way that would eventually infect everyone. He warned against isolation and neutrality and suggested that America should lead the world in using economic pressure to quarantine aggressive nations like Japan, Italy, and Germany. This meant to isolate them in a way that would stop their ability to wage war. Instead of changing American minds, Roosevelt's speech was met with a harsh backlash from isolationist leaders in his own country. The president backed down, remarking that it's a terrible thing to look over your shoulder when you're trying to lead and find no one there. In 1938 and 1939, Hitler's Germany embarked on a path that would soon bring almost all of Europe under Nazi rule. Using the excuse of reuniting German-speaking people everywhere, Hitler bullied neighboring Austria to join with Germany and to be incorporated into what he now called the Third Reich, the new German Empire. Just months later, Hitler announced his intention to annex or take the Sudetenland, a region of neighboring Czechoslovakia. This region had been German before World War I. Now Hitler wanted it back. Both Britain and France had a treaty with Czechoslovakia that promised to defend it if it were invaded. The Czechs were willing to fight to protect their territory, but the leaders of Britain and France traveled to Munich, Germany in September 1938 to meet with Hitler in person. They still hoped to avoid a war by striking a grand bargain with the Nazis. In Munich, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain took the lead in negotiating with Hitler. Hitler promised that if Germany could have the Sudetenland, he would leave the rest of Czechoslovakia alone and seek no more territory in Europe. Chamberlain and the other negotiators accepted the deal. They had once again appeased Hitler, but Chamberlain returned home to great acclaim and proudly announced that he had returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Winston Churchill, a member of the British Parliament, disagreed. Churchill had been warning his countrymen of the danger posed by Hitler for years and believed that appeasement was a huge mistake. "We have suffered a total and unmitigated defeat," Churchill stated after the Munich conference. "England has been offered a choice between war and shame. She has chosen shame and will get war." Winston Churchill was proven right in March 1939. The Nazis boldly marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia and easily conquered the country. Hitler had simply lied at Munich. Almost immediately, Hitler demanded that Poland, another bordering nation, return territory it had been awarded after World War I. This time, Britain and France realized that Hitler could not be trusted and would never be stopped except in a war. There would be no further appeasement. Both nations promised that they would defend Poland by going to war with Germany if it was invaded. Poland's other neighbor to the east was the Soviet Union, the former Russian Empire, now a communist nation under the rule of Joseph Stalin. Stalin ruled the Soviet Union as a dictator and was, in his own way, as brutal a leader as Hitler was. Nonetheless, the two men opposed and distrusted each other. Hitler hated communism and often spoke of the Russian people as subhuman. So it stunned the world in August 1939 when the Nazis and the Soviets announced that they had signed a treaty of non-aggression. It was something short of an alliance, but Hitler and Stalin both agreed not to attack the other or stand in each other's way. They also agreed to divide Poland's territory up between them. Now Germany could invade Poland without worrying about provoking Stalin to the east.